Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to give a minute as people come in. Welcome, everyone. I see people entering quickly here. I'm going to give another couple of seconds to get to critical mass. All right. Welcome, everyone. We'll keep allowing people in as they come. Welcome today. Good morning. My name is Mary Ellen McGuire, and I'm the president of PNPI. You're here today for our Researcher Spotlight with Casey Nguyen of the Institute for College Access and Success, otherwise known as TICAS. I'm joined today by Jared Colston, our Associate Director of Research. And the goal of this and all of our Researcher Spotlights is to introduce you to the work of up-and-coming researchers in the federal higher education policy space. Today, I'm going to start by introducing Casey, who then will provide us with a quick overview of her report, Shifting Narratives, Centering Race and Defining and Measuring College Value. Please feel free to submit questions you have for Casey at any time. You don't have to wait to the end of her presentation. You can do it while she's presenting. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Jared will ask your questions during the Q&A after Casey finishes her presentation. So Casey, welcome. For those of you who don't know her yet, Casey Nguyen leads the Racial Economic Mobility Portfolio at TICAS. Before TICAS, Casey supported state-level advocacy at the Education Trust New York and funding and development efforts at the Opportunity Network, a college access, college success, and career readiness organization serving students from historically underrepresented communities. She holds a master's degree in education policy from Teachers College, Columbia University, and most importantly, PNPI was a summer scholar. Casey was a summer scholar for PNPI in 2017. So we're very happy to have her today. So with that, Casey, what can you tell us about what you learned writing your report?
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Very excited to be here. Very excited to be with PNPI. Great. Great. Thanks so much. So hi, everyone. Good to see everybody here. Today, I'll be presenting on the report Shifting Narratives, Centering Race and Defining and Measuring College Value that I co-wrote with my colleague, Marshall Anthony Jr., who is the research director at TICAS. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I wanted to start by asking everyone a question. How do you determine the value of a college degree? Feel free to respond in the chat. I will give folks a couple of moments to respond. Great. You see earnings, earning more than a high school degree or earning more than a high school graduate, a well-paying job, economic mobility. Great answers. These are all great answers. Thank you so much. Glad to see you mention some of these indicators. We're actually going to be expanding on some of those during the presentation today. You feel free to continue responding. So as we know, a college degree is supposed to be associated with a better quality of life. And in some cases, that's true. But these outcomes vary across race. And while traditional metrics measure college outcomes using indicators such as income or debt by institution, that doesn't necessarily mean they account for how race shapes students' higher education experiences. For example, the racial wealth gap can bleed into inequities in college affordability, especially considering that Black households have 8 times less wealth than white households. Assets such as home equity and retirement savings aren't counted in the federal funding formula for financial aid. Institutions such as community colleges and minority serving institutions receive less funding and aren't able to adequately support their students. Community colleges receive half the funding that four-year institutions receive, and MSIs such as HBCUs and HSIs need billions of more dollars to best support their students. And then we have issues such as redlining, segregation, and voter suppression that also make it difficult for students to access college. In fact, Black students are more likely to owe more in student loans, and are twice as likely to default than their white peers. These are just some examples of bad policy choices and patterns of underinvestment, which further emphasize why race must be centered in any approach attempting to measure college value. Next slide, please. So here are some traditional metrics used to discuss college value. First, we have economic value, which measures annual earnings versus what students end up paying in debt. Then, and this is a more simplified way of measuring college value. However, the indicators such as earnings and debt alone don't necessarily account for racial inequities that impact them. Then we have the Economic Mobility Index, which looks at the opportunity cost of going to college for students who are low income compared to students with a high school diploma. And EMI provides a more nuanced understanding of college value while assessing how well institutions are serving students from low income backgrounds. However, low income metrics such as Pell status doesn't necessarily fully capture economic disparities by race. Next slide, please. So our race and economic mobility metric explicitly centers race by analyzing patterns across colleges with similar shares of students of color. So we grouped together institutions with similar shares, divided them into 10 groups, and took the averages of each group. We capture economic mobility by institutions based on these similar shares. We used average family income. We looked at the average of median earnings, and we also looked at the average rate of outstanding debt balance, so how much students still owed of their original debt. However, REM is not exempt from limitations, which are actually largely limitations of the data. The inability to disaggregate our outcomes limits our examination of these outcomes for students specifically. And so while we get close at looking at economic disparities by these groups of institutions, we don't truly know the economic disparities by outcomes, because that data itself is not disaggregated by race. So here we're looking at colleges grouped by similar distributions of Pell students. What we're seeing is institutions serving the largest share of Pell students don't necessarily always serve the highest share of racially marginalized students. So again, while Pell status is really helpful when we're looking at economic mobility, it's not a full proxy for race. Here we're looking at colleges grouped by similar shares of racially marginalized students in the aggregate. When we're looking at what college means for students of color collectively, the good news is that students attending colleges with the largest share of racially marginalized students are earning double of their entering family income. However, when we put this progress in context, this is inhibited by disproportionate earnings and higher debt levels. Why, you may ask? Students attending institutions with the smallest share of racially marginalized students. Students are owing roughly the same as they initially borrowed, if not more, and they earn $8,000 less. Let's take a closer look at Black and Latinx students separately. Thanks. So similarly to students of color in the aggregate, what we see here is that among the group of institutions serving the largest share of Black students, students typically earn twice as much as their entering family income, which is great. However, students in this percentile owe more than they originally borrowed, and this is 10 years after they began repayment, while earning $8,000 less than their peers attending institutions with smaller shares of Black students. And so this is really consistent with the literature previously on Black student debt, very alarming and necessary in any analysis assessing outcomes. Next, we're looking at institutions grouped by similar shares of Latinx students. When we look at our REM metric, when we use our REM metric to look at outcomes for Latinx students, the narrative is a little bit more nuanced. So unlike the prior tables, you can see here earnings and the percent of debt still owed fluctuate by decile. We think this may be potentially attributed to unique borrowing behaviors of Latinx students by sector, and we plan to explore this further down the line. We know students of color are not a monolith and they have different interactions with student debt. However, again, this data is not specifically disaggregated by race, so there may be more nuance not captured in this narrative. So our report, again, similar theme, calls for more robust data to disaggregate college outcome measures by race, account for borrowing behaviors and differences across regions, sectors, and minority serving institutions designations, and identify potential equity gaps in student outcomes and institutional funding. So what are our key takeaways? One, race must be a central component when assessing the true value of a college education. And two, contextualizing economic outcomes with a racial justice lens better captures the reality that students of color face before, during, and after college. All right, questions?
Thanks, Casey. Jared, I'm going to let you take the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And Casey, thank you so much for this work. This is just like a really important contribution to the post-secondary value literature and conversation around, what do you get from going into college and what do colleges do for students? And so thank you for this really important report. For people who want to ask questions, please submit those to the Q&A. And as soon as they come in, I'll start asking those questions to Casey. But for now, just to kick us off, Casey, just a really quick question. What was the most surprising thing you learned when you were doing this report?
Oh, okay, sorry. That's a great question, Jared, thank you. It was really surprising because there's a lot of literature confirming or affirming that racial disparities exist in education. But we were really surprised to see that that wasn't necessarily incorporated in existing measures of college value. There isn't a lot of data disaggregated by race, which we think might be a reason. But yeah, that was really surprising for us.
Yeah, definitely. And just kind of as a follow-up to that, I know you were using the college scorecard data here. Did you see that there was something, that this college scorecard added to, prior examinations of like iPads and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So college scorecard is kind of like a collection of all different data sets. And so it's basically using iPads data. So the data that we used from college scorecard can actually be found through iPads. There's also data from the Treasury, data from the National Student Loan Database, data system. It's just a collection of different data sets. So iPads too.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so how do you think institutional sector played a role in these outcomes? And have you looked at any of these metrics by sector, and does the scorecard even allow that to that point? So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I can. We believe institutions receive more funding are probably better equipped to serving their students. Institutions, receiving less funding probably tend to have like lower student economic outcomes. But those institutions tend to be community colleges, minority serving institutions, and there's a pattern of underinvestment in those types of schools overall. And they tend to serve the majority of students of color and low income students. So I think there's definitely nuance by sector. And answering your sub questions, yes, that data is available in scorecard. And yes, we're aiming to continue looking into that in future iterations of the report.
Great, thank you. We had a question in the Q&A. This is from someone anonymous. But based on your findings, are there different ways you would communicate the value of a degree to students of color specifically?
Great question. I believe this data is important for students to understand how their choices may impact their educational experiences. I think a lot of different things impact the value of a college degree, and that can start from even before you enter college. I think it's a very unique and individual experience, but it can be helpful for students to see, what is typical of an institution serving students that look like them, and how that may impact their experiences, with retention or with finding a job after college. And just because that is a pattern doesn't necessarily mean that will be your experience, but it's helpful to see all the same.
Getting a little closer at least, right?
Yeah, as close as possible. Yeah.
Right. So the next question actually talks a little bit about sort of the surprises, but it's wondering, or the person asking this is wondering, what would you do differently if you were to do this analysis again, now looking back, now that you're done with it?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's anything we would do differently. If I could, this report would be much longer, but we just wanted to kind of get this out there and start a conversation. And anything we didn't have the opportunity to explore in this first iteration is going to be coming out in later iterations. We want to just be continuing to build upon this research. Like I gestured to in the presentation, we want to look at the nuances in sectors. We want to look at nuances in institutions that have an MSI designation versus institutions that don't. So that includes HBCUs, HSIs, NAPZs, tribal colleges. And then we also want to look at how locale may also impact this. Institutions in more metropolitan areas may be receiving more funding, leading to better student outcomes. Whereas, institutions in more rural areas don't have the same resources to serve their students adequately to serve their students.
Thank you. Yeah. So kind of building onto sort of the end of your presentation when you were kind of calling for more robust data, someone asks, what are some of the kind of things that policymakers should be considering to make up for economic disparities? So maybe some of the policy recommendations that you might have after this report.
Yeah, invest in students of color and invest in institutions that serve them. I think it's twofold, right? Like in investing in both the students and increase investments in institutions that serve the majority of them, so that they have the resources to better serve them.
Yeah, I second that. There's another question too, because in the presentation you were talking a little bit about Latinx students and Black students, and so there was a question that, did you mostly focus on these populations, and was that due to a lack of data, or was that due to a specific targeting of these underserved populations?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Definitely something we grappled with. Yeah, for now we focus on Black and Latinx students. I'm like combining two, but Black and Latinx students and students of color in the aggregate, because there is more data. So that's true. And that's also partly why we want to continue looking at data like regionally, because there are pockets of Asian American students, of Native American, Indigenous students that just exist specifically in like different parts of the United States. So that wasn't because we wanted to exclude any one group. We just realized that that requires a closer examination, especially by region. And so that's also something we're hoping to explore as well. There will be further analyses based on different racial and ethnic groups, and it just might be tied to region instead of it being more of a national study.
Great, thank you. So Marianne McGrail asks, are economic success and mobility, are they the most important criteria of value for education for the graduates themselves?
I think that depends on how you measure success. And so for some students, graduating is their measure of success. If you can graduate, that's great. You got your college degree. I think the goalpost is moving beyond college graduation and towards economic mobility. Are you able to find a job that provides a family sustaining wage, a livable wage? Are you able to make your debt payments in time? And are you able to pay off your debt in a reasonable amount of time? Or are you still owing the same amount of debt after 10 years of beginning repayment? So I think one, to answer your question, it varies per student. And two, there are just so many different factors that inform success and mobility. And that just really depends on, one, your college experience, and two, the opportunities that are provided to you post-college. And we also know that that is impacted by racial disparities, or there are racial disparities that exist in that as well. Yeah, sorry, the question left, so I don't know if I fully answered it, but thank you. That was a really great question. Thanks, Marianne.
Yeah, that was great. And there's another question here, talking a little bit, going on to the recommendations section from your report. We've talked a little bit about recommendations for policymakers, but this person is curious about the recommendations to institutions that are trying to center race and maybe provide a better value for students of color.
Yeah, again, I think the main theme of this is investing in students. So, if institutions are collecting data on their students and looking at outcomes specifically on their from their students, I think just being able to disaggregate that data by race can inform where those investments should be prioritized. I think, any services that are specifically contribute or support the holistic development of students. So that's not just like academic advising, that's also career advising, that's student academic supports. I think I mentioned that. CAN counselors or CAP counselors, psychology, mental health services. There's just a lot of things that can impact a student's experience, and specifically students of color. So any resources that specifically support the holistic development, I think, are really important. But yeah, I would say in terms of a better value, like, you can't truly know that unless you have data, and then just being responsive to that data is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of building on that, so we've talked a little bit about what institutions can do, but for the institutions that don't do these things, do you see your recommendations as sort of calling or your data as sort of being able to call out specific institutions that are maybe bad actors, or not doing very well at serving students of color? Or do you plan on seeing this as sort of a, I guess, almost like a ranking system maybe, or something like that, where you're kind of seeing what institutions are serving students of color best?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think in higher education, we tend to frame things as like good versus bad, good institutions versus bad. I think it might be more helpful if we reframed it as resourced or under-resourced. We tend to really focus on the former, like, these institutions are providing or are graduating students with like high salaries, less debt. But I think we should our REM metric actually encourage us to focus on the latter. So it's not necessary. It may not necessarily be the institution's fault that they are graduating students with higher amounts of debt or lower earnings. It could be that, you know, these institutions are just under-resourced. Like I mentioned earlier, like community colleges, they are open access, and so they tend to receive students from all walks of life. And that can impact like overall outcomes, but that doesn't mean community colleges are necessary. They are very necessary. And we shouldn't be penalizing any one institution because they just don't have the resources to support all of their students.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of building on that, the next question is asking about using a social justice lens when focusing Black and Latinx student outcomes. And so I guess talking to a little bit about that resource versus under-resourced kind of framing, do you, what are your recommendations when using a social justice lens to center students of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think at minimum, you know, just being able to disaggregate by race, like you can't truly see which groups need more support if you don't know which groups need more support, if there's no data on that. I would also say, you know, understanding the racial disparities that exist even outside of education is also a really important factor. Race just impacts so much of our lives, like from education to workforce opportunities. So any related analysis that looks at education or looks at economic outcomes like requires an assessment by race or analysis by race.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got time for one more question, and then I'm going to kick it back over to Mary Ellen for the close. But just to finish things off, are there other existing federal data sources or tools, such as the college scorecard, that you think could be improved to help answer questions around race? And if so, which ones are sort of on your radar right now?
Yeah, like I mentioned, college scorecard includes a lot of data from different sources. And while that data source itself is so robust, you know, there's always room for improvement. I think starting out with IPED, since it's used so widely by our field, expanding that, and then also federal data sources that collect data on salaries or income. I think having that data disaggregated by race is really helpful. Right now, it's not necessarily disaggregated by race, or if it is, the data collection is either older, it's not as robust, or has been discontinued for whatever reason. And also because data is always changing and variables are always changing, that there's a lack of continuity, and it can impact, you know, our ability to measure things over time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing worse than a data set that hasn't been updated in a while.
Yeah. Some of this data is really old. It's like 10, 15 years old. So yeah, updated data, frequently updated data would be really helpful.
Right. Well, Casey, thank you so much for your work and for your presentation and the report in general and everything that you and TICAS are doing. I'm going to kick it back over to Mary Ellen for a close. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Jared.
Well, like all of our researcher spotlights, that went by very, very fast. But thank you, Casey. Before you all leave, there's two quick things. We would like you to take a poll that should be on your screen right now. It gives us information about what you may have taken away from today. And we just, you know, at PNPI, we always say we're about continuous learning. So if you could help us put us further on that path by answering the poll questions, we'd really appreciate that. I also wanted to mention that registration for our Federal Student Aid Bootcamp, which is virtual, for the spring session is open right now. It closes next Monday, March 6th. So if you're interested in digging deeper into federal student aid, it's offered on Zoom. It's both synchronous and asynchronous. It's a course that's online accompanied by live Zooms, Q&As with experts. So we'd love to have you. There is a student rate and a nonprofit rate to attend. So go over to pnpi.org. Casey, thank you. It was wonderful to see you again today. And thank you to everyone that spent part of their day with us today, part of their lunch hour. We were happy, or breakfast, happy to have you here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.